All right, that'll work. Fine, I'll record it. Anyway, the plane, if you want to see where your tracking space is, you essentially just attach a plane or a cube or something to your tracking area. And because, remember that in VR only your head moves because your head, your center eye anchor represents your head. If I don't have redirected walking or any kind of translational gain, then the actual tracking space doesn't move. So this white plane here, I can make it a different color. I'll make it orangey. This orangey plane here represents my tracking space, and if I don't have any locomotion method, then it just won't move. So in real life, this would be the edge of my guardian. Does that make sense? So that's what my script does for the Unity people. For the Unreal people, you don't really have to worry about this because Unreal doesn't enforce the camera location. In Unreal, depending on how you did the locomotion in Unreal, you might need to make it so that you only move the camera itself. But apart from that, this is a Unity specific problem. What else? The algorithm for steer to center wouldn't change. I'm going to modify the grade breakdown so that it's not based on grabbing people and doing your study. I'll just give you the data. I made some instructions on what to submit specifically for the non-VR people. For the VR people, nothing has really changed. What else? You should only grab objects when you're pretty close to them. So you can still do like click and raycast. That's fine, but just make sure that you're pretty close to the object. Like you shouldn't be able to grab everything from your initial position. I added the extra credit, which is translational gain. Translational gain is not that hard to implement. So, you should implement it if you have time. Since this assignment has a lot of effort associated with it, it's worth a decent amount, especially since assignment 9, well, the AI assignment will be totally extra credit. So all of the weight that was lost from there, well, most of the weight that was lost from the AI assignment will go into this one. And the extra credit for this is worth like 10%. So, if you're behind, this is worth a decent amount. The non-technical part hasn't really changed, except I'll give you the data instead of you collecting it. I changed the submit instructions for the non-VR people, and this I'm still working on. So, yeah. As for Discord, most of you are familiar with Discord, but for those of you who aren't, you have text channels where people can type. You have voice channels where I can talk. The general channel, I guess, I don't know, it's just general, I guess. Questions and office hours are for exactly that. So during office hours, if you want to ask questions about things. Logistics is exactly that, just logistics and things like that. Homework are for homework announcements like mine, or questions about the homework. Projects is for projects. Lectures are for if you have questions during this lecture and you want to ask them without using your voice. Random is for things like this. And if in your proposal feedback I recommended that you merge with another team, you can pitch your idea here and see if somebody bites. Because a lot of people are working on similar things, so it's fine to merge teams if you want. Office hours will still be at the same times, or I don't know. The benefit of using Discord is that you can kind of just post your questions whenever you want. So you can do that. Otherwise, I will have the typical office hours time, and I'll just add myself to the office hours channel when that happens. Yeah, don't go to the lab physically. If you need something from the computers, I can get them for you. If you try to physically go into the lab, you do still have keycard access, but you'll get a very passive-aggressive email from the department saying don't do that, like what the grad students got. Any questions about logistics so far? Nothing has changed. Okay, cool. I'm going to do a quick review of the last lecture, and since it was so long ago, and then we'll move on to the new material. So, next time we'll talk about 3D animation, which is really, really important. We also might do some review if people are confused about anything from the class until now. I think the midterm assignment covers up to audio and locomotion. So no information about navigation or anything like that, or AI. And I might demo some AI in Unreal or something. Animation is really lacking in modern VR, so it's important. It's also not well understood in general, which is kind of unfortunate because when things are not animated well, they just look bad. And in VR, obviously, things not looking good is a problem because it affects immersion. Animation, because there are so many methods and it's used in movies and games and everything, it's becoming one of the most profitable skills and also one of the rarest skills because people just don't understand it that well. And there are a lot of cool methods that we'll talk about, and I think it'll be a relatively interesting topic. So if there are no questions, then I'll just move on. Is everyone good? I don't know who Alexis is, but is that a question or are you just like virtually yawning? Great. So for assignment 7, I explained it more or less. The SPSS doesn't really change that much. The process is still more or less the same, except you have more dependent variables because you have 4 categories. In the Kennedy paper, they give you the exact equations here that tell you how do you calculate these values. So you create some dependent variable for each of these based on the data that I give you, and then you do the ANOVA on those 4 dependent variables. And your independent variable is still more or less the same, it's just the group that they're in. And SPSS has an option for multivariate. So this one was univariate, there's also a multivariate ANOVA. Last time we talked about how do you implement the good audio that we saw. I will post this lecture soon, but the general idea is that each of these APIs have a bunch of scripts that you attach to specific objects. So first you just enable the plugin, then you tell the game engine to actually use that plugin, like SteamVR, Oculus. To things that will block sound or reflect it or just occlude the sound at all, you'll attach a geometry component. You can also attach a material component to handle how things affect sound. So some surfaces are really thin and you can simulate that with a material. So for example, if any of the sound gets transmitted through the wall, like through an apartment. For the camera, you would attach a listener component. For things that will make sound, you would attach an audio component, like the API's audio component. So Unity has its own audio component, which you will also attach, but you also have to attach the API's own audio component. Unity has this thing called spatial blend, where you can say basically how much of the audio should be 3D. You can set that to be completely 3D. By default, it's 2D, so it's not spatialized. There is some manager thing that you would use to generate the meshes so that it essentially bakes all your geometry. Those of you who were in the audio lecture will remember this, otherwise I'll post the video. Then there's some export scene button and it bakes things and then you can play it and it should sound good. And I'll upload the demo. So, last time we were talking about social VR, at least we started talking about it. Social VR is pretty vague as a definition. There's this Facebook definition where you have these social VR games like AltSpace VR, VR Chat, and so on. I'm not going to play the video because most of you already know what these are. As a general definition, we usually think of social VR as just a VR system that has other characters. And these characters can be other people, like real people, or they can just be these AI-motivated characters, which we will call virtual agents. AI is also a pretty general term. Nowadays, most people think of AI as machine learning or deep learning. For the general public who are not into CS, they might think of the AI as these machines. Game devs usually think of AI as virtual agents, which are, I don't know, the word bot is used a lot as well. So these AI characters that roam your scene. If the AI is really bad, it will make people in VR really uncomfortable. So if your virtual agent walks through people, that will be weird. You'll have this weird ghost sensation usually. And we're naturally inclined to just avoid agents. So I showed this video last time of, oh my god, that's annoying. The Google Slides thing is in the way, but they did this study. Oh my god, this is... Alright, that'll work. They did this study where they were, they were showing the effect of different AI and how they affect the immersion of the user. Like if the AI actually moves out of the way, if they don't move away, if they stare really intently, and so on. So there are some cool studies related to this. There was this other study, or it's not a study, but it was a simulation by Microsoft where somebody could walk through a city, and in the VR headset they would see other people walking in the city as well, and they would avoid them appropriately. Oh my god, I never noticed this. These cars are having a fun time over here. I guess they didn't fix that before they published a simulation. But yeah, it was this weird simulation where you can walk in the real world and there would be virtual agents. Eye contact can also freak people out, so if the eye contact is too intense or if there's no eye contact, people will feel freaked out. And it could also affect your own immersion if your own eyes are simulated somehow. So this was used in simulations like there was autism therapy where people with autism usually respond better to virtual characters. So in training for people with autism, they have virtual agents that have eye contact too much or too little, and there are some studies on this. And I also posted one here. I'm trying to move on to the newer material. There's this uncanny valley effect, which everybody's heard of. It's when the virtual agent is kind of realistic, but something is off. So last time we saw this simulation of this dude who, first of all, just the way that they responded to you was very weird. I don't think it was NLP based, but in any case, the timing was off and the motions are off and all other kinds of stuff. So this was an example of that. There was this creepy dude from NVIDIA who was he was commenting on how the fairy character becomes uglier. He was saying that she becomes less beautiful when in motion. It was just a weird way to put it, but he's not wrong. I mean, in motion, characters do start seeming less natural than when they're static and just rendered like this. So you can check out these demos. Uncanny Valley can usually have a worse effect on immersion than just having very low poly characters, so we want to be careful about this. And there are a lot of things that affect Uncanny Valley, like bad facial motion, bad body motion, eye contact, bad talking, and things like that. So, and I mentioned this already. Moving on to handle Uncanny Valley. Once upon a time, people just tried to handcraft things. This has never really worked because there are a lot of subtle cues in human motion that are hard to handcraft, like eye rotations and subtle randomness and things like that. It's also very tedious. There are some demos like this Epic Games demo where they just track a real human, and that ends up looking pretty natural because they're tracking a real human, so they don't need to put as much effort into trying to handcraft these subtle motions that make the character look natural. And more recently, people have been using generative adversarial networks, GANs, to essentially learn what real human motion looks like. So they use it for papers like this, where they made real people say things that they didn't say, and it looks more or less natural. So factors that we will cover related to AI include collision avoidance, so how do you stop the character from walking into another player, social cues, so what should the virtual agent do when they get close to somebody, walk pattern and gait, so how do you make the motions natural, like how do you make a virtual agent identifiable. There's behavior to talk about, animation, which is a topic for next class, some constraints that we will see eventually, like navigational constraints, kinematics. There's a networking factor, so latency and things like that will affect how natural other people seem to you. There's body representation and avatars and anonymity, so like how do people feel like they are another character that they customized, for example. So like in VR chat when you're playing as Uganda Knuckles or whatever you're doing. how do you make the user feel like they are that character, and so on. So I think last time we ended at the end of navigation, so I'm just going to quickly summarize this. For collision avoidance, we want the virtual agents to avoid you. We need path planning for this. There is global path planning, so what is the ultimate goal, and how do we roughly want the agent to get there? And then there's local path planning, which is where will the virtual agent move relative to nearby actors. So in this case, this car, it's trying to, I actually don't know why the car would be doing this, but maybe it's one of those really inaccurate cars that we see in the robotics class here, that it just kind of swings left and right over and over again. It would have a path more like this, so it would roughly follow some trajectory, and then it would say, oh, I should go this way, and keep doing that. For virtual agents, the local path planning would be, we'll see an example in a second, but if you're avoiding another virtual agent, you would move around them, but then you would still keep moving towards your goal. We talked about navigation meshes, which are, it's a mesh that describes the walkable surfaces in the scene, and which surfaces are adjacent and things like that. A lot of the times this is done with some voxelization and A*, which is a pathfinding algorithm that's really, really fast. I believe it's a greedy algorithm, but it's used a lot because it's very efficient and it converges on an optimal solution very quickly. In much older games, they just used waypoints. So they basically hand drew these possible vertices on the path, and they would say, then they would use A* to move between different points on the path that they drew. So for example, in Super Mario 64, most of the enemies just kind of walk back and forth. In Metal Gear Solid, enemies have a very specific, like the guards move along a very specific path and things like that. So that's a waypoint. There are limitations, so there's a lot of wasted space. If you have to handcraft the points, it's very hard to handcraft every single point that is navigable, so you tend to waste a lot of space. Like for example, the character should be able to go up here. Can you see my mouse? Can people see my mouse? Okay, cool. The virtual agent should be able to move along the edges of this wall, but right now they can't. If you have a more automated system, which we'll talk about in a second, you can actually handle this. Waypoint-based paths tend to be really, really simple. The enemies are very predictable, and it's just kind of boring. And there's also just a lot of manual labor that comes with trying to generate these graphs by hand, because, you've all used Unity at this point. Imagine trying to place all of your game objects really, really accurately and then drawing lines between them. It's just not that easy. So we started trending towards navigation meshes, which they still describe all the walkable surfaces, but they are essentially automatically generated waypoint graphs that factor in things like jump heights, like can the character jump from this surface down to here, step height, so if you have stairs, can they get up those stairs, how wide the character is and things like that. The basic idea is that you essentially project, well, there are many different navigation algorithms, but imagine for this very simple scene, you just project all of these tiles down to the ground. You use the 3D definition. So for example, a square. Remember that we generally try to use triangles. So a square is computed with two triangles that are adjacent to each other. Imagine that you project the entirety of the surface down to the ground, and then you use the vertices of all of the triangles of the 3D mesh, and then you run A* to figure out where the character should move. So in this case, this might just be their starting position. Maybe in this case they subdivided it so it's actually like 4 squares. So that's why it generates a point here, and then it will find the vertex at the corner here, and so on. That's how navigation meshes work. They're just graphs, and you use some pathfinding algorithm to navigate them. And you know, if you had a character that's kind of wide, in this case, they're not really modeling the width of the character, but if you had a character that's wide, you could project the points inward so that they're not as close to the edge. And that's how a navigation mesh works, basically. There's a pretty good read here that explains at a very high level how they work. They're very efficient, and we can actually generate them real time. So you can basically generate an entire navigation mesh every few frames. Or even for a really simple scene, you can generate it every frame, which means that we can have dynamic obstacles nowadays. For 3D navigation, it's a lot of 3D navigation is just a simplification into 2D. So for example, this is 3D technically, but if we just project surfaces, then we can make it 2D. In some cases, we can't do that, like for flying objects. So what we do is voxelize the scene, as in instead of subdividing the scene into squares, we subdivide it into cubes, and then you do a 3D version of A star. As we'll talk about in a second, in order to figure out which way the character should face when, we need to use 3D splines. And as a quick example, there is this cool Unreal plugin that does 3D navigation. So you have these spaceship things that are flying around, and you know, they had this example where this spaceship is navigating through this corridor, and the walls are moving up and down, and they dynamically generate the mesh so that the dynamic walls actually do matter. I don't know why when does he start it? Yeah, I don't know. That's a very long explanation video. But here you can see the voxelization and stuff like that. So 3D navigation isn't that common in games anyway, but it's just an interesting thing to think about. It's more of a modern trend. So moving on. I mentioned splines before, just to quickly introduce you to what these are. Splines are interpolants which have a certain amount of differentiability. So an interpolant is some function that gives you information about where it gives you some approximation about data that's between 2 points. So for example, if you have waypoints, like let's say that you can walk along this path, a spline will tell you, it'll give you some smooth surface or some smooth line that the character can navigate along. And for our purposes, we don't need to worry about this too much, but does anybody have some idea of why differentiability is actually important? Anybody who's good at calc? I'll give you like 15 seconds to think about it. Any answers? Otherwise, I'll just move on. The reason we need differentiability is because if we generate a spline between a bunch of sets of waypoints, we want to be able to merge all of those splines together in such a way that they're still smooth at the point that you merge them. So imagine if I generate a spline between these 3 points, and then I generate another spline between these 3 points. If I want to put the 2 splines together, I need them to be differentiable at this point, down to a certain amount of differentiability, and then the character won't so like if I'm trying to get the character's orientation at this point, it won't be a sudden jump. That's what that's for. Generally, games use Bezier splines, which have control points. So with Bezier splines, you rotate these lines basically to say, how curvy should this loop be. And this is an example of a 3D Bezier spline. So these red stars are the actual data, and the blue and green things are different splines that were computed for that data. So you don't really need to understand splines that well. They're just a good thing to know about because you would definitely run into them in game development. They're used for a lot of things. Even in 2D graphics, they're used to make curved surfaces. In 3D graphics, we use them for animation and navigation and all other kinds of things. So we talked about global planning, which is the navigation mesh basically. As for local planning, we have a couple of different methods. a very common one in game engines is this method developed at UNC called RVO, Reciprocal Velocity Obstacles. And the basic idea is that if you have these two virtual agents that are about to walk into each other, there's some ratio that describes how likely each of them is to move out of the way. And so in this case, they have basically the same ratio. So both of them are just as likely to get out of the way. So they do so. So they move one way. One of them moves one way, the other one moves the other, so that they don't collide with each other. And their velocity and that ratio that describes how likely they are to get out of the way are used to determine like how far does, if this character on the left is moving really fast, or if it's a really angry person or something like that, this one over here is going to move way out of the way, and this one will probably keep walking in a line. So that's basically how RVO works. There's a paper that you can read if you're interested. But yeah, this is very common in game engines. Unreal 4 has RVO built in, actually. It's a part of the character class. Unity has this navigation mesh agent script, which you can use. It has a property called Avoidance priority, which is essentially that ratio that tells you like how likely they are to get out of the way. It goes up to like 100, I think. So you can have like 100 levels of, I don't know, niceness, essentially. You can think of this sort of like, for each frame, the other character is a static obstacle, and you recompute the navigation mesh and the path on that navigation mesh. That's more or less how it works. It's maybe an oversimplification, but it's a very fast and commonly used method, so it's good to at least know what it's called. Just to talk about this limitation for a second, Unity has a major limitation in its AI system. Those of you who play a lot of Unity games might have noticed that they have very questionable or very simple AI. This is actually a well-known and pretty objective criticism of Unity. Its AI system is really limited. It only has a nav mesh built in. It doesn't really have any other AI functionality. So they don't have behavior graphs or anything that you can use to formalize the AI behavior. You essentially do it all through code. And unlike a couple of other game engines like Unreal and Frostbite and engines like that, Unity doesn't have any relationship between the navigation and the animation, which means that it's a little bit hard to get the character to, like if they rotate a certain amount, it's hard to get the animation to do the same thing. So it means that it's a little bit hard to make dynamic AI in Unity. There are some implementations that are sort of helpful, but they're not great. You'd basically have to program the finite state machine and do all the vector math yourself. There are some implementations of behavior trees in Unity. We haven't talked about behavior trees yet, but we'll see them eventually. But they're all really limited. But it's good enough for basic things, and for the extra credit assignment, it shouldn't be too much of a limitation. This is more of a limitation for if you have a really complex AI or if you have a lot of them. So, like I said, it doesn't have behavior graphs. So some examples of RVO. This is an older paper from Gamma, rest in peace. Actually, this is the original RVO paper, so I'll speed it up a little too. So you have these characters that have different goals, and they use RVO to avoid each other. So yeah, it's fast enough that you can do this simulation with 250 characters real time, like in Unity or Unreal or something. And so they all avoid each other, and they go to essentially the opposite side of the circle. So it's a cool little method. And they have some more use cases. So if they have another navigation mesh that's a constraint that describes the obstacles, you can still use RVO. RVO is essentially just another factor that gets added to the navigation mesh calculation. And then they go back to their place. Another example, this is an example of inside of Unreal. So here you have your very standard dumb AI that doesn't have any kind of collision avoidance. And since they don't have any collision avoidance, they just don't do anything. With RVO, you can see them avoid each other like that. And they're comparing against some other AI method that's clearly not great. But you can use them both in unison to make decent AI, I guess. It's still not supernatural. But yeah, I mean, these are, hopefully you get the basic idea. If you have any questions, you can just speak up or something. But I think the idea at a high level is pretty simple, and I don't think it's important to know how exactly it's implemented. You can just think of it as you have a navigation mesh already, or say that on a given frame you want to compute some navigation mesh, you want to do your A star thing. You can treat these squares as obstacles, and you can also add in on any given frame the other characters. You can add those into the computation of the nav mesh. That's sort of how it works on a high level. There was this other cool experiment that they did kind of recently. Actually, I don't know how recent this is. I think it's relatively recent. It's within the last 3 years, I remember. Anyway, what they did was they tracked real people, and then they added virtual agents that avoid the real people. It was a kind of cool paper. So, there's some computer vision thing here that's some computer vision deep learning thing that's recognizing who the people are, and it tracks them. And then what they did was they added pedestrians. So some of the green pedestrians, I think, are just used to describe the real people. But yeah, so the yellow people here are all virtual agents, and the green people are real people. So you can see that the results are not that great. Their tracking is not great, but it sort of works. I mean, it's a cool idea, I guess. They have this little simulator. I don't know if their simulator is public, but yeah. So just a cool little related work. This gets into crowd simulation, which is essentially a stress test for AI. In movies and other forms of media like games, we might want to see many AI on a screen. Let me actually show this slide first. Who is that? I'm going to mute them. Mute. Okay. So for example, in The Hobbit, there was this, there are fighting scenes and you have tons of these AI. They're all computer generated AI, and you want a ton of them, and you want a gigantic scene that describes them fighting. So, you simulate it, and you can use these pathfinding algorithms to do this automatically, more or less. So you can see there are tons of people, and pretty much all of them are computer generated. So this is crowd simulation. In terms of simulation, we have simulations that were also done by Gamma. So in this case, there's all these booths, and people are walking around and trying to find their way to a conference, and they were simulating it with and without RVO. So before, the AI were just kind of walking into each other because they don't use the other AI as constraints. But when you use collision avoidance, you actually can, you can make kind of natural looking AI. This guy was still pretty dumb, but most of them are, it's a reasonable attempt. I think that this paper is almost 10 years old, so for a paper that old, it was pretty good. And there are much better algorithms in the last few years. But yeah, you can do these massive scale simulations with algorithms like RVO because they are that efficient. And these will work more or less real time. well, maybe not this many people, but you can do a decent number of AI characters that can do RVO real time. Let's see. There was this other example where they're navigating really narrow corridors. The frame rate's terrible, but this is just another example of an application. So narrow corridors are kind of hard because if you have two agents that are walking into a narrow corridor, they might just get stuck if you don't have smart enough AI to deal with that problem. So here's a protest. This is like the most peaceful resolution ever, but you know, it's a simulation. Crowd simulation was originally intended for movies because, you know, consumer PCs could never really handle that many characters. Even on my i9 that I'm using right now, I can only handle maybe 100 dynamic nav mesh constrained AI in my own simulation. Characters that look decently good, that have some randomness in their behavior and so on. So crowd simulation is kind of hard. There are a lot of optimizations, such as, let me add this transition quickly. There are a lot of optimizations, like you can simplify the collision meshes. Generally, they just use cylinders or a 2D circle that's projected onto the ground. We simplify the navigation algorithms, like A star is very fast. It doesn't work for every single circumstance, but it's really fast. You can have simpler nav meshes, so you can have fewer vertices to navigate, which will let you compute a path faster, but you'll have fewer possible paths for them to navigate. You can decrease the accuracy of the simulation when the camera is farther, or you can decrease the accuracy of a single instance, a single AI. So for example, in the Hobbit example, or in this example here, like, would you really be able to tell if every single character is navigating well? Like, no, you wouldn't. So that's an optimization that we make sometimes. We're not at animation yet, but once you get the navigation info, like the path that the character should traverse, if the virtual agent is described with visuals, which is pretty much always the case, they should also respond visually to any changes in trajectory. So you might want them to respond to the trajectory itself. So speed and rotation matter. Their body should rotate. They should walk faster. You know, you might want a running animation. You might want to model what they're close to. So objects, other characters, and so on. Like in, you know, the Assassin's Creed games, for example, when you're walking through a crowd, your character, like, you know, they move their shoulders around and they stand sideways and things like that. Also, you might want to model identifiable motions. So you don't want every character to look the same all the time. So you might want to describe their gait. So people walk in a pretty unique way, the emotion with which they walk, and so on. So this gets into this more recent trend called emotion AI. So for example, this is also work that was done at Gamma, rest in peace. But I always say rest in peace, but Gamma does exist, that's at UMD. But anyway, the idea is that you can describe emotions through the gait. So if you want an angry character, you might want them to walk with this sort of gait. If they're happy, they might walk with a more jolly gait, and so on. In this example, what they were doing was, this robot was trying to predict, oh god, the controls. I'm gonna slow down the simulation a little bit. In this paper, what they were doing is this robot tries to figure out the emotion of the person that is walking towards them, and they use that to figure out how close they're allowed to walk. So if somebody is like super depressed or something, the robot might want to stay away or something like that. And you could also use it to model what the robot should do in response to that person. So maybe they'll go up to the person and ask them what's wrong or something like that. That was what this paper was about. There's another extension of this work where they were doing it with a lot of people. So still do crowd simulation. except the crowd simulation is, this is more augmented reality where you're creating virtual constraints based on real constraints. But they recognize the people, they simulate the actual, nav mesh, so which areas are free to walk through, and then it moves based on that information. So here's some cool papers that you can check out if you're interested in this stuff. So for crowds in relation to the player, we want crowds to both avoid the player and each other. We want them to move pretty naturally, as we just talked about. So their walk pattern should be pretty good. You might want them to have decently realistic eye contact. You might want to implement randomness. They should also respond to the user appropriately. So if the user gets too close, you might want the AI to look at them. You might want some kind of vocal response. They might have some kind of action and so on. So some great demo videos also from Gamma. There is this cool page that has a bunch of examples of work on the subject, except it froze. So in this example, what they were working on was these guys reconstructed themselves in the simulation, and they also, I think they also reconstructed their gait. I don't remember exactly, but they were playing as themselves in this game, and they went up to virtual characters, and I don't know if you can hear audio. Can you? I don't think the audio works with the screen recording. Okay, it's fine. You can always look at this on your own time, but this AI is giving them some information about how to get somewhere. So like, this is Andrew Best. He works at an autonomous vehicle company now, but Andrew is going up and asking the character for some information, like how do I get to Sahil? And they used NLP to generate what this character should say, and they also used that information to generate decent body motions. So that was a cool application of, the natural movement and stuff like that. They were also doing crowd simulation in VR. Well, this one's on VR, but oh yeah, this one's in VR. So they have to walk. I remember this user study. You had to drop this cube into that red square, and as you walk there, the AI move out of the way. So that was what this was about. And I think this was a comparison study to see which method seemed more realistic, like personalized gaits or non-personalized gaits. They did some work on reconstructing people's gaits. So for an individual, they would record them. They would record their body, which we call a pre-scan. We'll talk about reconstruction later, but this is just a pre-scan, so figuring out what their body looks like. Then they use the connector or something to figure out how they walk. Then they synthesize some gait to be used for the virtual character in the simulation, and then they can do the simulation. Some other methods. I know we're out of time. This will be our last slide. They were doing some more synthesis of personalized avatars. These are kind of cool papers if you want to check these out. Then they were also doing like eye contact and stuff like that. So, this character is looking at the player maybe too intently, but the characters which are really far don't look at the player. So, a bunch of other simulations. Like this character here these characters are avoiding you completely. There are other characters that might not avoid you. This dude is like staring hard. I don't know why, but he is. And yeah, you can just skim through these simulations if you're interested in this stuff. There's stuff about verbal interaction and so on. It's up to you. Oh yeah, sorry, this will be our final slide, and I'll just show you this work quickly. There was this work, my Chrome is freezing. There was this work on figuring out somebody's emotion based on their walking pattern. And so if we look at this video, for example, they use data-driven models to figure out what the person's emotion is based on you know, how they see the person is walking. So who's that? I don't know why they use me as an example of happy. Anyway, here you have an angry gait, and they measure valence and arousal. And they use those to figure out, you know, on that 2D graph where the person is in terms of emotion. So yeah, just some cool crowd simulation stuff. That's all for now. Next time we'll talk about animation and networking and do review and stuff like that. So yeah, you can also ask questions on Discord if you want. So yeah, I'm gonna stop my stream. Any questions? I mean, you can just log off whenever you want.